Good morning, Medical Alley. It's good to see everybody this morning. I want to welcome everybody to Supply Chain Operations in the Age of COVID-19, What We Know and Where We Go, sponsored by King Solutions. My name is Shay Mandel. I have the honor every day of serving as the President and CEO of the Medical Alley Association. And throughout COVID-19, our association has been focused on providing leadership to assist our nearly 600 members and the state as we navigate this pandemic. At the outbreak, we worked with the governor's office and supplied them with access to a collection of supply chain experts, important for today's conversation, including many of our foundational members such as 3M, Mayo Clinic, Boston Scientific, and FedEx. And we established Resource Connect to bring together those members in need with those members that could help. Today, we're kicking off the first episode in an ongoing series focused on providing all of you with resources and perspectives on the way forward. And we hope this is valuable as you navigate what we like to call the new abnormal. Specifically, I want to thank King Solutions for its leadership in sponsoring this event. And I also want to thank our Medical Alley team for making this production possible. We're excited today to have with us Craig Broman, the Chief Operating Officer from Centricare, Christine Meidinger, the Chief Operations Officer from Nonin Medical, and Scott Munson, the Global Supply Chain Leader for the Healthcare Business Group at 3M. For our audience, we'll be inviting your questions as we get toward the end of the program. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function on our Zoom at any time during the episode. And now I'd like to ask each of our panelists to take a couple minutes and introduce themselves, starting with Craig. Craig, good morning. Craig, you're on mute, which is good panelist protocol. We appreciate it. Craig, good morning.
I don't know how many times I've done that in the last 3 months, but anyway, good morning. As mentioned, I'm Chief Operating Officer for Centricare. I also serve as President of St. Cloud Hospital. Centricare is a health system, integrated health system here in central Minnesota and west central Minnesota. We have 8 hospitals, 8 nursing homes, about 40 clinics throughout about a 16 county area in central Minnesota. And St. Cloud Hospital is really the tertiary hospital, referral hospital for our entire system. Many of the other hospitals are critical access hospitals, and with the exception of Rice Memorial, which is also a prospective payment or PPS hospital. So I'm glad to be with you today.
Thank you for joining us. Christine?
Hi, thank you. Christine Meidinger. I've been with Nonin Medical for about a year now and just completely blessed and honored to be a part of such a company. 35 years ago, our founder invented the first fingertip oximeter, and through COVID, it has given the world a view of the importance of, excuse me, of oximetry for the monitoring and measurement of patients with severe COVID. So Nonin manufactures and is located in Plymouth, Minnesota. We have about 220, 250 employees, and we really appreciate everything that Medical Alley does for the community.
Thank you. And good morning, Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Munson. I'm the Global Supply Chain Lead for the Healthcare Business Group at 3M. Well, I've been with 3M for the last 23 years. I've been in the manufacturing plants for about half that time, so about 12 years I've been in manufacturing plants. About the last 11 years or so, I've been up at 3M Center. I've been with the Healthcare Business Group for about the last 10 years, and I've been in this role for about the last 3 years. So we're really trying to drive a world-class service throughout the organization and drive a competitive advantage with supply chain. And thanks for having me.
Well, again, thank you to all of you. It is generous for you to spend your time and appreciate the comments your commitment to helping this community. You know, we're all in this together, everyone says, but sharing your expertise with the community, it's really an honor to have you all here. So let's jump right into it. So we're in the middle of, dare I say, an unprecedented pandemic. And so for all of you, you know, what weaknesses in the supply chain do you think have been most exposed during this pandemic? And Craig, why don't we go ahead and kick it off with you? We'll go around the horn and move it around.
Okay. Well, I look at that question really from two perspectives, internally and externally. And I think the weakness that got exposed internally in our organization really revolves around data availability, and our agility at analyzing data in meaningful ways so that we could communicate with our clinical partners. So that it really highlighted the importance of good, accurate data relative to supply chain. And then when I look at externally, and where we had a weakness there, it was the visibility and the evaluation around where products origin, or the origin of products. So where are products manufactured? Where are the raw materials coming from in the globe, around the globe? What types of supply disruptions have been planned for, and are there disaster preparedness plans by our suppliers for many different potential disruptions that could be, you know, weather, as we learned about from hurricanes a few years ago, and access to supplies, to political issues globally as well, and now a pandemic. So it's really a combination of internal weaknesses and external weaknesses.
I appreciate you identifying that. Christine, I want to, you know, I know you guys have had, everyone's had interesting experiences, but you guys at Nanan have definitely had some. Your perspective on the weaknesses that have been most exposed.
Sure. So similar to what Craig said, data, but in general, the pressure of whether it's growth or this type of demand globally coming to us really exposed weaknesses within any of our business processes. So when you have to do things fast and accurate, it really makes you stop and take a look at what you do, not only from the standpoint of do we have the right process, but can we simplify that process so we can do it faster, better, and be able to have a greater output for the world, for the global medical community. And internally, that was a big piece. The other was that internally we had to grow very quickly. So bringing on new employees in a time when everyone is quarantined is quite difficult as well. So that was a real challenge. And having to very quickly make sure that all of your facilities are as safe as they can possibly be, and making your employee safety and health the number one priority from an operations standpoint. Externally, we had challenges with our global supply base, primarily because we don't have the leverage from a government standpoint, regardless of what the size of our business, even to have a China local government or territory or India government listen to us too strong when we say, hey, we need this product. And so there were many, as you know, many different countries shut down their borders, refused to let the manufacturers reopen. One of the things that was fantastic is that our CEO was able to work with both U.S. government officials and with Medical Alley to encourage those foreign governments to really work with the suppliers, and it was successful.
Well, thank you for the plug as well. We do like to encourage, but I appreciate also highlighting just the operational ties together. And so, Scott, as I turn to you, looking at weaknesses, obviously, 3M's been front and center. And I know you guys have had to shift a lot of things around. From your perspective, what weaknesses in the supply chain for you were most exposed during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think when we talk through from a manufacturing and a supply chain standpoint, when we talk through the weaknesses, so it's really about what kind of lessons we've learned and how we can ensure that our supply chain doesn't break. It is a complicated question and it involves a number of different layers. We have to look at it from a strategic perspective. We have to look at it from a global perspective. We have to look at it from a social responsibility standpoint, and then also analytics and data, as was already brought up as well. And so those were a lot of the things that we took into account when this first hit our radar. So as we're talking about strictly about the weaknesses, as Craig said, I think that they were both internal and external. I don't think anybody was expecting anything at the size that we currently have. So we obviously were not prepared from a supplier readiness standpoint or a manufacturing capacity standpoint. I think we were able to scale up our distribution and our transportation fairly quickly. It was primarily from a supplier and a manufacturing capacity standpoint. So our processes we kind of ran through with the business team and some of the analytical people to put together some high-level numbers on what we think that we did need from a ballpark standpoint. Obviously, this is an evolving number that is continuing to grow. Then we put in plans for a short-term plan, a medium-term plan, and a long-term plan as well. So first off, so we started to work with our suppliers and potentially new suppliers as well to ramp up into the volumes that we needed. And then we were looking internally as well. So really, the things that we needed to do ASAP as this hit our radar is we need to hire a whole bunch of new employees, as Christine had said. I think in the COVID situation that we currently have as well. So there's quite a bit more involved with that as well. And then also from the equipment capacity position as well. So we had to do what we could with our current equipment. What could we do very quickly with our equipment to be able to wrap up production as much as possible. And then after that, so we were looking to take out any kind of waste in the supply chain that we possibly could. One of the areas that we were able to identify fairly quickly is instead of going through 3M distribution to send this out to the hospitals, so we were able to ship this directly from our plants. So that was a big win for us. I'm taking out a few days. So trying to streamline the supply chain as much as possible. So I guess ensuring that the suppliers could supply, we're maximizing output from our production locations, and then taking every piece of waste out of the supply chain. I think another area would be on inventory as well. We typically do have a fair amount of inventory within 3M, our external distribution, and then we have a smaller amount in the hospitals. Obviously, they can't take as much with that. But obviously, in those quantities, we're not large enough to be able to accommodate what we're dealing with now. I think another area is in the government or any other stockpiles that did exist. Those also were obviously not enough to be able to speed the recovery that we're currently seeing. I've been to the CDC a few times over the last 10 years to help them try and calculate what kind of quantities we might need for a pandemic. And it's not an easy calculation. And there's a lot of different things that have to go through to get funding as well. But I think as we're going through the pandemic right now, I think this is going to change a lot of people's thinking in regards to what we do need to be prepared for.
Thank you. And, I know we're going to chat a little bit about that global supply chain, some of the things that you've all mentioned, and a little bit of lessons learned. But I also think people want to know, as a follow-up to the weaknesses, it feels for most of us sitting at home like this happened quickly because all of you function more globally. Obviously, there was a little bit of lead time, and government response is something I think we'll continue to evaluate. But for each of you, when during this pandemic did you start to see the issues that caused you to really take a look internally and externally in the way you've characterized. And Christine, why don't we go ahead and start with you on that question? When?
Sure. So right away at the beginning of March, about the same time that COVID introduced itself in Minnesota, we started getting the noise of increased demand. Unfortunately, we had no idea what that meant. And so the initial was such a scramble to determine what that need was going to be and how to react. And a lot of it really was a leap of faith throughout the month of March. Coming into the beginning of April is when we really started getting our arms around the breadth and scope of what it meant for Nonin, for our products, and for our key customers, especially some of our larger OEM customers that were under some of the DPA orders. So probably, March we started reacting very quickly. By mid to the end of March, we were able to respond more strategically, specifically within the supply chain. But really throughout the month of March was when it was all hands on deck, let's figure out what this means.
And Craig, let's bounce that over to you. Obviously, you guys have a little bit different lens as a health system. And so when for you, did you start to experience the supply chain challenges that you've articulated?
So, if you think in terms of how this pandemic impacted the U.S., we started hearing about Washington, the state of Washington, and it really didn't appear in Minnesota to any significance until March. But it was coincidental, totally coincidental, that pre-COVID, in early January, Cardinal, which is one of the major distributors in healthcare, notified the industry of a recall of surgical gowns. And these were surgical gowns produced in China. And that created a major shortage. And all of a sudden, all of the people, we don't buy our surgical gowns through Cardinal. We get ours through Medline, but that created a shortage in January that we began to see some allocation occurring. And it was on January 24th that our GPO, Vizient, notified us that we needed to begin assessing where we were with PPE supplies. And so it seemed somewhat early at that point. And then it was a ripple effect. Then we began hearing from some of our suppliers, including Medline, that there was going to be allocation of PPE. So it was probably fortuitous that we received this benefit of some early warning that supplies were going to be in demand, and that caused us to begin to really pay attention to our data. What's been our usage? What's our current inventory level for PPE? And it really sent a strong message to our organization that we needed to prepare. And then we began to hear from other suppliers as well that there was going to be allocation coming forward in the coming days and weeks. So that all really led up to when we started seeing our first patients, which were in the middle of March for positive COVID patients.
And I know you guys at 3M, I mean, obviously a big supplier where this started. So talk a little bit about, your experiences when this happened and how, some of what happened in China led to what we've experienced in the United States.
Yeah, and so for us, I mean, it hit pretty early on. So we were able to get some pretty good visibility in regards to how this was going to progress fairly early on with China. We did start to get in some larger orders come from China and Asia fairly early. I would say in the December timeframe. And then obviously, after it moved to EMEA, things started to explode. It has been very interesting to watch the progression of this and the impact on the supply chains and the healthcare supply chain. So it seems like there's been, a 4-week kind of process in between. So it started with China and Asia, then moved to EMEA, then it came to the US. And now, so we're kind of seeing some of the same things that we were seeing with the US, maybe 6 weeks ago. I think we're seeing some of that in Latin America that had just started here over the last couple of weeks. So I think overall, we were able to know and understand fairly quickly. I think in regards to the overall demand, I think so there were so many orders coming in that we didn't always know what exactly was needed versus what was an inventory stockpile. So that was very early on. So we were able to get that figured out, like I said, pretty quickly, I guess, and working directly with the hospitals in the States.
So you've all made some reference to the global supply chain. I do want to ask a couple questions. As we've talked about government, I think we can all anticipate that at least the US government wants to do something about the global supply chain. And that doesn't always, the rhetoric doesn't necessarily align with, I think, all of the ways we think about it in industry. But I'll just ask, I think the provocative question, would a less and much more local supply chain have made a difference? And is it something for us to be thinking about? And Scott, why don't we kick that off with you?
Sure. Yeah. So this is really a great question. I think this is one of the areas that a lot of companies are going to reevaluate based on some of the behaviors that we've seen from the other countries as we've been going through this. I think there's been a wide range of cooperation throughout the globe. I think we need to look at it from a resiliency standpoint, a risk mitigation standpoint, and also from a global perspective. I think it comes down to you want your supply chains and your manufacturing to be in the same area that you are selling the product. So if you're selling the product in the US, that is where you want your manufacturing. If you're selling your product in Europe, that's where you want your manufacturing. So you always want to be as close to the customer as possible. So, as we talk about some of the respirators, we have a very significant manufacturing footprint in the US, and we have a very large demand in the US as well. So, and that's an area where we are going to continue to grow our capacity. We have a social responsibility as well to be able to meet the needs here in the US. We are also a global company, and so we do have needs outside the US from a manufacturing perspective as well. So those are things that are going to be continued to be evaluated. As I stated earlier, so there was a wide range of cooperation that we're seeing from countries. And so those are things that are going to go into the decisions that we will make in the future on our investments.
And Christine, talk a little bit about this issue. I know you guys have, a supply chain, including for the US, that's a little more dispersed. Would a local, less global supply chain have made a difference for Nanan?
Right. So one of the things that's interesting with our product is that every one of our components and materials is custom and unique. So there isn't an inventory or a stockpile out in the market that we can leverage. Instead, we do have a majority of our supply base is domestic, but you only have to be short one component and you can't build a unit. And so having our supply base, our global supply base that is outside of the US, currently being in Asia, almost exclusively, whether it's India or China, it is a challenge. I think one of the things that I've learned that I would make sure to do differently is within my supply agreements with global suppliers is to have an understanding of what their agreements are or what their position is from a government standpoint if things were to happen again in a similar fashion. Is there a special designation as them being a medical supplier so that they have that preferential ability to get back up and running faster? I think those are questions obviously that we never thought of asking before was, what do you have in place, not just a disaster recovery, but what do you have in place for the governmental controls that are out of the normal viewpoint. So the other thing that I think that really came to mind is to make sure that we have some, if we do need to be in a lower cost geography, you know, to make sure that we've got something that's in the Americas as well as Asia, so that we're not bound to going over the sea or specific border shutdowns. You've got the same complications sometimes even between Mexico and the U.S. But to make sure that we have that capability. The other is your, you know, you spoke earlier about it, you mentioned inventory. You know, a lot of this comes down to inventory planning and making those agreements with the suppliers as to what inventory they're willing to hold as a potential, you know, there's standard safety stock levels, things like that. But especially if it's at a greater risk because of geography or political government issues, to make sure that that's accounted for within your agreements, within your inventory planning.
And Craig, I'll ask you to finish up this question again, as an organization that is truly on the front lines of dealing with the patients and people affected by this pandemic. You know, would a more local supply chain, from your perspective, have helped, or at the very least, would it give Centricare much more confidence in your ability to be able to react to another pandemic?
In the case of a global pandemic, I do believe that a less global supply chain would have benefited us. Is that the ultimate decision or the ultimate best solution? I think it really depends on the circumstances, because there are other disasters. It could be weather related, you know, hurricanes. It could be political related, you know, civil unrest, trade wars between countries, etc. That it wouldn't necessarily apply. And so I guess I think the ultimate decision is probably finding what is the right balance between global, national, and local supply chain. But certainly in the case of this global pandemic, yes, less reliance on global would have benefited us.
I want to ask all of you, you know, I think on some levels, right, the big question. So while we're still learning a lot of lessons and all of you continue to make adjustments as the pandemic plays out, and as you've articulated, looking at what, you know, what that future sort of holds, you know, what are the great lessons that we've learned, and, you know, what can we be doing going forward? And Christine, I think I'll start with you on this one. Christine, you're still muted.
You know, I think it's a little bit of a no-brainer, but it really is. Am I still muted?
You are good. We can hear you.
I am good. Thank you. It's a little bit of a no-brainer, but it's the importance of the relationships. Most of what we as an organization were able to accomplish, and this is everything from the PPE needed to protect our employees, through some of the government negotiations, some of the negotiations with our suppliers as to where to put us within their priority list. It all came down to relationships and the networks that our leadership teams had and were able to reach out to. Some of it was just incredible. You know, you were able to get that? That's incredible. And we have suppliers, we have some suppliers that have worked with the company since its foundation. And those guys were willing to do anything. I mean, they were willing to go invest we had suppliers immediately go invest in new capital equipment, in material and everything else without going through a whole bunch of bureaucratic, normal steps. And that was completely based on relationship. And it's your relationship with your customers and your relationship with your suppliers, and leveraging your network, the people that you know and who they touch. It really has been probably one of the strengths of being able to respond as quickly as we have. And I think the other piece is with looking at that risk and being really open with your supply base and your supply chain and say, hey, we're in this together. We're both taking some risk. We have to do this minute for the global good. Are we in? Are we all in? And you're sharing that risk with your suppliers, you're sharing that risk with your customers. And when everyone's doing it for the right intentions and motivations, it works out. And when it doesn't, I think at one point we talked the other day about the risks and, what risk did your company face? We did face some of that. And at the end of the day, you have to come back and say, okay, yep, that one didn't work out so great. What are we going to do to resolve it? And again, it's that relationship with your customers and your suppliers.
Very good words for everyone to live by. Don't take those relationships for granted.
Absolutely.
I love the comments about sharing risk, and I think those are some of the things going forward. Craig, tell us a little bit from your perspective, lessons learned and kind of the way you see us moving forward.
Again, I would look at both internally and externally, going back to my prior comments that internally, lessons learned was the importance of good, reliable data and having an integrated supply chain process across our enterprise. The more standardization we can get around product across the enterprise, and having really one source of truth for our data internal to our organization. And then as I look at externally, again, I go back to the fact that historically we have been focused on the cost of a product, the quality of the product and the outcomes. But I think kind of the fourth pillar now is having more visibility around the manufacturing supply chain and distribution networks. Again, knowing where do the products, what is the origin of our products from the manufacturers, what are their disaster plans, and what type of agility is there built into the system to respond to these unanticipated events. And then the third would really be piggybacking on the comments that Christine made about the importance of strong networks. Through this entire pandemic, it has proven the importance of our relationships with our peers across the state, with community, because community has come forth and provided us PPE product, just donated it to us. Our national distributors, the importance of that relationship and that network, manufacturers as well as local suppliers. It's really all about how do we come together and collaborate and create strong networks to respond to these circumstances.
And I appreciate that, Craig. And I think we can, your comment in particular about visibility, even prior to the pandemic, one of the things this community has been focused on, and therefore our organization, is that connectivity among sectors that allows, medtech and biotech and pharma, payers, providers, just to get a better sense of how, each sector is approaching a problem and look for those collaborative opportunities and relationships to provide that visibility. And so again, thank you for calling that out. And Scott, so we've heard about relationships and visibility. I'll ask you from 3M's perspective, what are the big lessons learned and how does that impact you going forward?
Yeah, and I think there's a few different things. So the first thing is for sure is to never underestimate the value of surge capacity. So I think as you have some of these critical products, and you absolutely need to make sure that you have surge capacity in place. I think one of the other lessons that we've learned is, so 3M is a big company, but we've been able to move very, very fast on increasing our capacity. And so that's something that I'm very proud of. So we talk about speed to target, and I think this is something where we have been fairly agile in being able to scale up. But I think back to Craig and Christine's point as well, I think, an absolutely critical piece of this is to make sure that from a supply chain perspective, you are very collaborative with all your partners. And I would say to be collaborative with them as well. Yeah, so go out and see them before these things hit. Have a good relationship, I guess, before these things happen. So when it does happen, we're in just a much better spot to be able to drive forward and be a lot more positive as we're going through some pretty difficult times.
So just to follow up with all of you, so we've talked about lessons learned, and again, thank you for all of you sharing kind of what you're learning in your company and how you're thinking about relationships and visibility. I'll ask you is there a silver lining in all of this? Has the crisis, lots of lessons, lots of figuring out how to go forward, but is there a silver lining in terms of innovation or resiliency that you all think the crisis has handed us? And Christine, I'd like to start with you.
Sure, thanks. I think that within the resiliency is where Nonin will end up benefiting the most. As I mentioned before, all of our components are custom, which means we were also single sourced on all of them. And that creates a huge challenge, not only when the supplier isn't able to reopen, but also just in sheer capacity. And so we very, very quickly stood up second and third suppliers on critical components. And our engineering team was able to quickly find them, get samples, get them through validation, so that as the volumes ramped, we were able to mitigate that risk of having a supply gap by having a second or a third source available. And it even to the extent of two of those suppliers sharing material, even though they're both in a little bit vying for the same business. There was a shortage on a connector, and one of them was able to get a bunch, so they shared it with the other one. So that's, that resiliency and making sure that you've got some sort of duplication available. You can't do it on everything, but on the critical parts, when you've got 20, 30-week lead times, you just can't respond quick enough, no matter what, when you're single sourced on certain products. The resiliency internally as well. I will say that Nonin has put an incredible focus on internal communication and internal relationships. When this all started, the team was putting out daily communications to the whole organization. And even still, there are daily and weekly communications, extremely transparent. Nonin really commits that to the employees to be transparent, both in the challenges that we're facing, and really being open to have people come and tell us, because we know this is stressful. We know it's touching everyone, and any of that stress on your employees is going to affect everything that they're doing down the road with the suppliers, with the customers, whatever. And so the resiliency of your own employees in your own organization is just as critical as the resiliency within your supply base.
I think based on everyone's comments, we can do an entire additional webinar just on the operational challenges of what our employees are all experiencing, certainly the just pressure and psychological impact. And we do have a webinar coming up on mental health, which I'll mention at the end. But we'll evaluate a follow-up with this group. Scott, what is your silver lining in all of this?
Yeah, so in the past, so at 3M, so we've done pandemic planning in the past before. So this is really going to change the way that we approach our pandemic planning. Obviously we're going to have to plan for some more extreme things that are going to happen out in the world. I'm talking through from a risk mitigation standpoint. But I think as we've talked about before, I think where we have our capacity around the globe here in the US, outside the United States, I think that's going to be a critical piece for us. And so that's going to be something, where we've done some learning here even over the last, 6 to 7 months. It's going to have a big impact on where we do make those investments. And then there's also the social responsibility piece as well, that is going to be a big piece of that for us. Again, so we have a long way to go. But I think based on, the learning that we've done here over the last 6 to 7 months, is going to put us in a much better position to be able to respond to some of the significant events that may happen.
Craig, how about your silver linings, if any?
Well, I think the whole pandemic has exposed, as our conversation reveals, it's exposed a number of weaknesses. And I won't try and repeat those. I think the conversation already has identified many of those, and now it's our responsibility to see what do we do to improve or strengthen that supply chain process going forward. And so I think there is a silver lining in that regard. The fact that, we've just been competing against each other basically to get in the provider side of healthcare to get supply, and that even continues to this day at these extremely high costs, multiples of what we would normally pay. And many of those never arrived on our loading dock. We've had to cancel some because we were pretty concerned about the quality and of product. And so hopefully we can find ways of avoiding that chaos that we've been dealing with. But when I look outside of just supply chain, there's a number of lessons that we've learned and benefits. Our employees have told us that never before has our communication been any better than it has been in the last 2-3 months. We've been able to make decisions quickly, from closing clinics to setting up acute respiratory clinics to closing units and setting up dedicated COVID units in our hospitals. And so that decision making and communication, I think, is all improved as a result of this experience. And I would say if you use like telehealth, we had difficulty getting providers to adapt to using digital patient visits. And during this pandemic, we've just seen, not just in Centricare, this is a national change, but a major shift to adopting digital-based patient visits. And those are some of the things that we want to retain going forward, that you really don't need to go into the office every time you have a patient or you have a clinic visit. And so how do we take these lessons learned and make sure that we continue them into the future in our new normal?
New abnormal.
Yeah.
Well, clearly, this is obviously just the beginning of these conversations, and certainly for the mass of U.S. citizens, this has provided conversations about and insights into our overall healthcare system that I think give all of us an opportunity to work together and improve that, not just in times of crisis, but overall. We've gotten a ton of questions and obviously won't have time to get to them all, but I would like to ask you all, a question or two, depending on our time, that we've been getting from our audience. One of the questions relates to automated processes. And the question is, what processes within the supply chain should be automated first, and what process is the biggest pain point? So looking to dig a little deeper into your expertise. Scott, why don't we start with you? Talk about automation and the biggest pain point within your supply chain.
Yeah, and so we're a global company. obviously, I think the more that you can integrate your technology across the globe and have, end-to-end planning, I guess is what we would call it from a supply chain standpoint. And the more that you can link that with technology, I think the better off you're going to be. I think the speed of the information flowing through and the advanced notice on when changes are coming through, I think you're definitely going to benefit from that. Yeah, I think, and as far as some of the weaknesses, so your data is only as good as the data that you put into it. So the systems that you use is only as good as the data that you have in them. I think from a master data standpoint, I think it's absolutely critical that you spend time on your master data and you keep that up to date. So then as, things are changing and things are flowing through, you're able to make the best decision possible.
Greg, how about for you? Still on mute, Greg.
I guess I got to work on my adaptive change as well.
Everybody gets one time.
My second mulligan. Anyway, why don't you repeat the question one more time?
Absolutely, as I go to unmute. Our question from the audience is, what processes within the supply chain should be automated first? What process is the biggest pain point?
Yeah. From a health system perspective, I would go back to my prior comment about having, one enterprise resource planning system that would go across the entire organization. So you have really one source of truth relative to data. From a supply perspective, I like the idea of being able to receive product directly from manufacturers, kind of the Amazon distribution model, to kind of accelerate getting product to us, and maybe more transparency around what are our inventory levels between us, the provider, and our supplier, so that we're in constant communication regarding inventory levels. And that could be our day-to-day operational perpetual inventory system, but it could also be where are we sitting relative to our pandemic or our disaster inventory.
Right, and I think, so not only on the pandemic products, but I think really across the board. I think the more that people can do things like VMI and connect electronically, I think, as Craig had said, I think the better off you're going to be. And because we do VMI with a number of our larger distributors, and so it does really help, I guess, with some of the leading indicators as well, because we do know and understand what type of inventory they have on hand.
Yeah, we are the state. I'm losing the title, but we're for one of the state cohorts for central Minnesota and a couple of the western areas of Minnesota for disaster preparedness. And the cache that we had here for PPE, much of it was outdated. And it's like, that's a problem with, managing data. So there was product in a warehouse that should have been available for us. And I think the state had some of that same problem. Maybe the federal agencies, FEMA, et cetera, had that as well. But with good data, we could avoid that.
Christine, you want to jump in on this?
Mine is a glaring answer, which is our internal planning systems. And someone said earlier, the data out is only as good as what you're putting in. Managing the information here to react and respond to this pandemic has been extremely manual for Nanan. And at the same time, you've learned that you have to have your process laid out, and you need to be able to do it on a piece of paper before you employ a tool. Well, we have the tools, and still, because of the data, and I go right back to what Craig said at the beginning of the meeting, is how very important accurate data is. Giving our suppliers visibility, as Scott mentioned, the ability to share forecasts with them, and I've been sharing not even just like piece part forecasts, but just here's our big picture view of this product line over the next year. Even that kind of visibility. So automating some of the communications, some of the high level visibility, even with the supply base is very important. And right now for Nonin, being a much smaller fish in the pond than you guys, we're working diligently on our internal systems to get there.
Christine, in Medical Alley, we're all big fish. Don't ever forget that.
There you go.
We do have a limited time, and I'll share with our panelists again, this conversation has generated an extreme number of questions. So for our attendees, I apologize, we won't get to do them all. But I'll ask one of the last overarching questions before I hand it over and introduce Mike Patterson. So one of our attendees is asking the question, what value could have been created with an early execution plan on the part of the federal government and a broader expansion of the Defense Production Act as it relates to PPE? Would that have been valuable? Scott, sorry, I didn't hand it off.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I guess I don't know if I'm the best person to respond to that. So I don't know, I guess Craig or Christine.
From a provider perspective, I don't know that we've gotten any support. I'm not aware of Minnesota healthcare providers that have received any support from federal or even state relative to product that we needed. We've really been all on our own. And I think that's one of the weaknesses that has been identified, because that's created this, competition. We're all just fighting for ourselves, making sure we get ample supply. And it has been pure chaos to try and identify suppliers. And, many have asked for money down from 25% to 100%. And you don't know if you're going to be getting counterfeit product or not. So it's been really crazy. We've been fortunate so far, knock on wood, but I think, again, these are lessons learned, and we've got to find solutions.
I think the biggest challenge that we saw was simply as it relates to PPE, knowing that the medical workers so desperately need it, but the essential businesses that are supporting that need it as well for our employees. And that was a real challenge. I mean, I was shopping on Amazon for masks, and everybody was scrambling as much as they could to find product. And then you're worried about counterfeit product, or is it ever going to show up? And we experienced some of that as well. So absolutely, if the government had been able to point to dedicated manufacturers or suppliers of PPE that were specifically held for medical communities and medical essential companies, that would have been a huge help.
Fantastic, and I appreciate, with a dicey question, given where we're at, everyone's response. This program is possible today because of King Solutions, and I want to invite the founder and CEO of King Solutions, Mike Patterson. And Mike, before I kick it over to you, I just want to say, obviously, King has been in the middle of this as well. Your expertise could be shared, and you'll want to acknowledge and appreciate both your expertise, but in particular your leadership in sponsoring this and allowing other leaders from our community to take center stage and talking about their experiences. So I'll turn it over to the King Solutions headquarters, and again, founder and CEO Mike Patterson. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Shay. I would like to thank Shay and Medical Alley for allowing King to participate today in this important event. I have certainly learned a lot as a logistics provider listening to each of the panelists, and we thank you for this privilege to be part of this today, and I mean that sincerely. King is a local company. We have 170 employees, over 525,000 square feet of warehousing, CGMP certified and temp control. We are hopeful to help our local medical industry achieve the goals that now and what they're hopeful for in the future. We always remind ourselves at King, when we're working with healthcare companies, we're talking about, at the end of the day, lives of people. It's not just product we're handling. There's a bigger purpose here, and it gives us each more meaning in our jobs. So we're anxious to do more in this space, and if we can be of help to you, we're here to help you. One of the panelists mentioned earlier today about collaboration, and really that's the DNA of King Solutions. To provide a solution, it's all about collaboration. So thank you once again. It's an amazing experience today to be part of this, and we look forward to doing more in the future.
Mike, again, thank you to you and your team. I think there's been a consensus today in talking about the importance of relationships and collaboration. And for everyone in Medical Alley that's joined on to this webinar, again, we're the best in the world at those relationships, connections, and the association is proud to work with all of you to showcase your leadership and help to bring together the global epicenter of health, innovation, and care. Craig, Christine, and Scott, I want to thank you for your time, your expertise. Great to see you and all of your companies expressing your leadership. Mike, again, you're working with King Solutions. There's been a team effort on both sides of the equation. Appreciate you guys and what you do for our community, and in particular, sponsoring this webinar. For everybody who's in attendance, I want to thank you on behalf of Medical Alley and King Solutions. And I'll invite you to join us next week for our webinar, Coming Together to Address the Crisis in Mental Health, How Health Plans, Clinicians, and Consumers are Using Technology to Provide New Approaches. It's sponsored by Bind. It features a couple of our board members, Jody Hubler, president of Bind, Ashish Saxena, who's president of Best Buy Health. And I would encourage all of you, you can find it on our website, and please join us for that coming webinar, as well as additional webinars that we'll have. Again, a lot of questions. I think this was tip of the iceberg. We'll be capturing all the questions that you as attendees submitted and having this conversation in continuation with King, with our other partners, including our panelists. For everybody, have yourself a great Medical Alley Day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you all.